Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. At the end of the last episode, we discussed two important figures who would have major impacts on their own time and on the centuries to follow, Martin Luther and King Charles of Spain. We'll start today by talking about Luther. As I mentioned in the last episode, Luther was a Saxon and launched the Reformation from the Saxon city of Wittenberg. So why talk about him in a podcast about Austria, a famously Catholic land? The answer is that for Luther to survive unscathed the initial reaction to his protest against the Vatican, he had to negotiate the politics of the Holy Roman Empire, now ruled by the Habsburg family, who were also the rulers of Austria. In addition, although you wouldn't know it looking at Austria today, the Reformation sank deep roots into the soil of Austria, and it was only with a concerted effort that Catholicism was reasserted in the Habsburg monarchy. We also talked in the last episode about Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer who was executed for heresy a century before Luther. Part of what we should try to determine in this episode is why Hus failed while Luther was successful. But let's start with a more general concept. It's said that the modern period in European history begins around 1500, but what does modern mean in this context? It means a few things: greater literacy, urbanization, industrialization, the emergence of a bourgeois class, as well as the creation of a middle class. The process of modernization in Europe is said to have begun with the Renaissance, which provided for some liberalization of government and the contribution of scientific thinking to European intellectual culture. By 1500 or so, although pre-Renaissance forms of thinking still prevailed in many places, society was opening up more and more. The rise of Luther is tied to all these phenomena. For one thing, literacy was a huge factor in Luther gaining the support of a larger and more diverse number of people. By introducing the printing press with movable type, Johannes Gutenberg, who was an artisan from Mainz in the Palatinate, contributed to a revolution in literacy and information sharing. Before Gutenberg, books had to be written out by hand, a process that took months per book. Now books could be printed in far larger numbers in a far shorter amount of time. Unsurprisingly, the first book to be widely printed was the Bible, specifically the Vulgate Latin translation used by the Catholic Church. Luther was not only an Augustinian friar, which is a point often forgotten when discussing him, but he was also a professor of Bible study at Wittenberg University, so he was literate in both German and Latin. In this regard, he was not unusual. Many members of the clergy were literate, although not all of them. Rather, literacy tended to correlate with one's level in the church hierarchy. Lay people, therefore, had the lowest level of literacy, followed in order by monks and nuns, priests and deacons, bishops, and the Pope. But there was no guarantee that everyone at all levels was literate. There still is not today, but it was even less the case back then. Moreover, even many people in the nobility were also illiterate. Gutenberg changed that. With an abundance of books came a far lower cost to teach people to read. Of course, the desire of powerful people to control the flow of information remained substantial, which is why Luther's case was so important. Luther published his 95 Theses, the text that first drew the attention of the Vatican, in Latin. However, the subsequent texts that he wrote, which resulted in his trial, were published in German, and they drew the attention of the nobility and some common people as a result. After all, few of those people could read Latin, but many more could read German. Compare Luther's case to that of Jan Hus. While Hus had the important support of the King of Bohemia, he nevertheless lacked more widespread support because so few people had read his arguments. The second key issue was the lack of ability of both the Emperor and the Pope to enforce their wills. This point requires a bit of explication. It's not as if these two men completely lacked the ability to coerce people to do what they wanted, given that they both commanded armies. They certainly did have that power. However, bearing in mind that the period we're examining was one in which electricity, the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, telegraphy, and countless other technologies did not yet exist, there was necessarily a geographic limit to how far a powerful person could exert their influence. We have already seen that, despite the Holy Roman Empire being a sort of central government, the numerous states under its control were constantly fighting one another, and often they were fighting the Pope as well, to say nothing of those times when the Pope and the Emperor were also fighting each other. Jan Hus, like Luther, was an educated man who taught at a university and promulgated his ideas in that venue. In doing so, he drew the attention of more orthodox authorities within the Church. Importantly, at that time, the Catholic Church was undergoing its so-called Great Schism, during which there were two and sometimes three simultaneous claimants to the throne of St. Peter. Thus, although Hus was originally protected by the authority of King Wenceslas, the king's brother Sigismund, who was then the king of Germany and eventually emperor himself, betrayed a promise of safe passage for Hus to Constance in what is today southernmost Germany. Hus was arrested upon arrival in Constance, tried, convicted, and executed in short order. Contrast this case with Luther's. First, shortly after Luther posted the 95 Theses in 1517, they were translated into German. Within a few months, they had been distributed across Central and Western Europe. Luther had addressed the Theses directly to the Archbishop of Mainz, who in turn had sent them to the Vatican before the end of the year. Pope Leo X set about investigating Luther and determining whether he had committed heresy. The Pope first warned Luther that he would be excommunicated if he did not recant. 6 months later, Luther was in fact excommunicated. The 95 Theses were banned, and Luther was summoned to appear before an imperial council, or diet. All these points would seem to make Luther's case more dire than that of Jan Hus. By Luther's time, the Great Schism was over, and the emperor and the pope were on the same page with regard to Luther's heresy. However, while Hus was betrayed in his promise of safe passage to Constance, Luther's guarantee of safe passage was respected. He safely arrived at Worms in April 1521. Then, because his guarantee of safe passage included being returned home safely, Luther left Worms without recanting, and Emperor Charles V issued an edict in May formally declaring Luther a heretic and removing him from the state's protection against harm. However, despite some attempts to have Luther arrested and executed, he never was. One important fact is that there was more than one monarch supporting Luther. In addition to the Elector of Saxony, the German state that Luther called home, he enjoyed the support of several other monarchs in the empire, although not of the emperor himself. The emperor's edict could only be enforced as much as the monarchs under the emperor's authority agreed to do so. If they refused, the emperor could not do much else beyond periodically reminding them that Luther was an enemy of the government. Plus, the horses had pretty much left the barn by the time Luther appeared at Worms. Other reformers had emerged or would emerge shortly in Switzerland, England, Scandinavia, and elsewhere in places beyond the control of the emperor. Before we leave Luther behind, we should take a moment to be clear about what he actually believed. Essentially, there were three things: the inerrancy of the Bible compared to the dogmatic approach to knowledge of the Catholic Church, the ability to be saved by faith alone compared to the Catholic requirement of both faith and good works, and the denial of several of the Catholic sacraments as truly being sacraments. But the reasons why many Europeans, particularly the ruling elites, chose Lutheranism over the Catholic Church was more concerned with politics than with belief. It was 2 years into Luther's mission that Charles V became emperor and inherited rule over Austria. He would not be crowned by the Pope for a decade, but his grandfather Maximilian had established the precedent of the emperor being crowned outside Rome, so Charles was made emperor immediately. He was ultimately crowned by the Pope, but he was the last emperor to undergo that process. That said, Charles served as the Archduke of Austria for only a few years. In 1522, he abdicated in Austria in favor of his brother Ferdinand. Charles remained the Holy Roman Emperor, but Ferdinand would rule Austria. We should briefly acknowledge that between 1519 and 1521, Charles resided over one of the largest empires in human history. It was Charles V's empire, about which it was said the sun never sets. Only later would this saying be applied to the British Empire. Moreover, Charles was easily the most powerful man in the world in his time, or likely any time before then. But as we have already seen, even this power was limited in how far it could extend. So we'll leave Charles behind for now, although we'll likely see him at least once more. Instead, we'll follow Ferdinand back to Vienna for the 30-odd years that Ferdinand ruled Austria. Two key issues were the focus of Ferdinand's attentions. First, Habsburg rule in Bohemia and Hungary, and second, the continuing Protestant Reformation. The first issue, that of rule in Bohemia and Hungary, came into focus in 1526 when King Louis II, who ruled the two countries in personal union, died in battle. Both Bohemia and Hungary had elective monarchies, as did the empire itself, and Ferdinand put himself forward as a candidate to be the king over both realms. Bohemia quickly confirmed Ferdinand as its king. In Hungary, different factions backed either Ferdinand or a Transylvanian count named John Zapolya. The two men went to war, with Ferdinand winning twice, and Zapolya fled to the Ottomans and enlisted their help. As a result, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire besieged Vienna, with the ultimate result being partition of Hungary. There would be a Habsburg portion of Hungary governed from Vienna and an Ottoman portion governed by the Sublime Porte. Ferdinand would try once more to acquire Hungary by invasion when Zapolya had died and had been succeeded by his son, but the Ottomans again intervened. War continued sporadically for decades. Nor was Ferdinand's rule over Bohemia a calm affair. Revolts by both the nobility and Protestants had to be put down with Austrian or imperial power. In the case of the Protestant insurrection, Ferdinand and his brother Charles faced off against the Schmalkaldic League. So what was that? It was an alliance of Protestant monarchs in the Holy Roman Empire who banded together to pool military resources and power. Established in 1531, the goal of the Schmalkaldic League was to prevent encroachment on League members' territory by Emperor Charles. Their guiding philosophy was the Augsburg Confession, which explained their Lutheran beliefs to the emperor. Unsurprisingly, Emperor Charles rejected the Augsburg Declaration, although Ferdinand acknowledged its validity in declaring a religious peace in 1532. For more than a decade, this religious peace held. It broke down only when Charles began building alliances with some of the Protestant monarchs and mobilizing an imperial army. A short war ensued, which Charles won, gaining the ability to depose the elector in Saxony. A second war with the Schmalkaldic League occurred in the 1550s, which the League won. The ultimate upshot of this peace was a treaty known as the Peace of Augsburg. According to the Peace of Augsburg concluded in 1555, any monarch within the empire could decide on the official religion in his domain. Freedom of emigration was given to those who were of a different faith. The exceptions were the so-called ecclesiastical states, which were ruled by bishop-electors. If a bishop-elector changed religion, the people living under his jurisdiction retained their own religion, and the bishop was forced to resign. Finally, in a section known as Ferdinand's Declaration, some knights in cities were exempted from the first rule, particularly if they were in one of the original Lutheran strongholds. That's where we'll leave things for this episode. We'll pick up in the next episode with the effects of the Peace of Augsburg, the remainder of Ferdinand's reign as emperor, and how Protestantism fared in Austria. Thanks for listening.